wow, I could have done that study for $500,000. You know, like they often get big grant money to tell you things you kind of already sensed. Well, one of the things that he discovered in his study, which you already know and can kind of sense, is that across these kind of 20-year-olds, there is a huge amount of diversity when it comes to ethical questions. That there's a huge divide on what they think. You just have to look at what's going on in our country, and that makes all sorts of sense. But he did discover that there was one thing that all of these young adults that he interviewed agreed on. Only one thing that they all agreed on across the sample of the people he interviewed. And this was the question, the one thing that they agreed on. He asked them, is there ever a time where it is wrong, where it is actually immoral, where it is absolutely wrong to buy something? Is there a time where it's wrong? In his sample, almost every young person he asked overwhelmingly said, no, it's never wrong to buy something. Some of them added a caveat like, well, listen, if you can't afford to buy your daughter diapers, then you probably shouldn't get the new iPhone 7. But most of them said, if you can afford it, it's never wrong to buy something. Now, I think this points to the fact that we actually use what we buy to actually define who we are. And don't we say things like this all the time? We don't even know what people do, but we'll say things like, well, I don't know what he does for a living. He drives that car. Well, I have no idea what she does for a living, but, they live in that neighborhood. That we use what we buy to actually project who we are. I have a cousin who's 3 years older than me, and we grew up in the same community, so whenever we get back together for a holiday or a family get-together, we'll often talk about who have you run into from high school or who have you seen. And now this is a Facebook world, so I don't know, maybe I'm just confessing my Facebook angst, but don't you hate that these people that parents particularly that you couldn't stand in high school, you now need to see pictures of their kitten for eternity? It's like, I know you can block it, but it just seems like so much work. But we'll often run into, who did you run into, who did you talk to? And a few times he's gone on this rant where he'll say he's at, a sporting event or somewhere out in town or something, and someone will come up to him that he knows, and they'll start talking, and they'll say, yeah, so what do you do for a living? And then he'll go on this rant that he absolutely hates it when anyone asks him what he does for a living. And he'll say, why do people ask me what I do? I'm so much more than my job. Why do people actually care what I do for a living? I'm so much more than my job. But then the conversation will transition, and I'm as guilty for this as he is, but we'll often transition to the new flat screen TV he wants to get, the new addition they want to put on their house, the new Jeep Cherokee he wants to buy, and he absolutely hates it when anyone asks him what he does for a living, but has no problem of talking about what he wants to buy or what he owns. That I think that we tend to use what we buy to actually project who we are. Or think about it this way, I've already confessed to you, and Hans pointed this out too, that I watch way too much TV. And I just do feel like the TV raised me, so I owe it 8 hours a night, Like if you had an aunt who was there for you growing up, you'd spend a lot of time with her. That's how I feel about the TV. So when I turn it off, I kiss it before I go to bed at night. But for a TV-aholic like me, the worst thing ever is the on-demand button. Have you ever, you hit the on-demand button? Especially when you live in Minnesota like we do. It's like on a beautiful June day, the last thing you should be doing is watching 6 hours of TV. But when you're a TV-aholic and you hit that on-demand button, it's like, hey, there's 15 episodes of The Facts of Life. I should watch that. For you young people who don't know what The Facts of Life are, you have no idea what you've missed. So one day I was, going around the on-demand button, and when you're a real TV-aholic, the first thing you hit is HBO, because that's where the hard stuff is. So you go right to the HBO first. So I went to HBO and I saw a documentary, or I guess it wasn't a documentary, it was one of these historical dramas, one of these Tom Hanks historical dramas that I hadn't seen before. It was called From the Earth to the Moon. Have you seen this? It's probably like 2000-ish. And it's all about the Apollo moon missions in the 1960s. Now, this just shows you how much I listened in social studies when I was in high school. I knew nothing about the Apollo moon missions in the 1960s. And so I watched it. I just binged watched it. And I was learning all sorts of stuff. But the one thing that I learned that I was amazed by, and I think this was very historically accurate, that in the early 1960s, these astronauts were incredibly deep vocational people. I mean, they were fighter pilots. Most of them had war experience, flying jets. They had to be top of their class mathematicians. Many of them were star athletes at the universities that they went to. And when they became astronauts and were in the space program, they became celebrities in the culture. They sold orange juice and were on talk shows. Now, that's the mid to early 1960s. Now, just let's fast forward from, say, 1965 to 2015, and from an astronaut who does trigonometry and hard mathematics all the way to Kim Kardashian. what does Kim Kardashian do? What does she actually do? Like, for God's sakes, we know she can't sing and act. Like, what does she actually do? She doesn't do anything except, I guess, get robbed for $10 million. You see that in that story? What does she do? She doesn't do anything, but she does one thing very deeply, profoundly, is she buys stuff. That's what she does. And then we can actually live vicariously through all of her purchases and all of her pseudo-fame or legitimate fame for not really doing anything. But think of that transition from celebrity in this culture being someone with incredible vocational depth to this place of consumption. That we actually, I think, now use what we buy to project who we are. And the advantage of this is all you have to do is stop by the mall, go to the Apple store, change your consumer patterns, and you can feel like an all-new person. That's all you have to do. Change what you buy, change what you wear, and you can feel like an all-new person. Which probably points a little bit to this whole makeover phenomenon, which if you've all seen The Personal Makeover, and if you haven't, you just need to go home and turn on TLC on your cable dial, and it's like the 24-hour makeover channel. And if you've seen The Personal Makeover, they're all the same, aren't they? They're about 25 minutes or 22 minutes, and the person gets the makeover, and they all end the same. They end with the camera in the face of the person who's had the makeover, and they are asked to do what's called in the business the confessional. They're asked to confess what this experience has been like, which is pretty interesting language. So they have to do the confessional. And what do they say in the confessional? They almost always say the exact same thing. And when they describe what this experience has been like, they almost always use evangelical language. They talk about transformation. What this experience has been like for you. This experience has changed my life. I feel like an all-new person. I feel like I've been born again. What's happened? They got their teeth whitened, they got a new closet of clothes, and they got a new haircut. But it feels like the very catalyst to feel like an all-new person. And now, of course, with pretty easy credit, you can go a long way buying without much money at all. All you need is a credit card. You can go pretty far. I had an experience a few years ago where I decided to finish the basement in my house. I don't know what had happened. I think I watched too many episodes of This Old House. I was like, I could do this. So I went to the basement and I decided I would frame this up. And the whole idea of the project was that I would finish the basement. I would put all the kids' toys downstairs. Then one Saturday afternoon, I would put cookies on each step. I would lure them down into the basement. I would lock the door behind them, let them fight in the basement, and pour a glass of wine for my wife and I, and we would have a great life. That was the whole idea of what this project was going to be. So I started, insulated the walls, got everything up. But then it must have been from God, because I was putting this kind of wall up, this last wall, and I heard this holy angel sing. All of a sudden I heard, ah, because I thought to myself, oh my gosh, a flat screen TV would go perfect right there. And the whole project changed from playroom for my kids to home theater for me. So I had to do the very important, very exhilarating, but also kind of gross drive to Best Buy to get all the needed components. So I loaded up my car with surround sound system and the flat screen TV. And then I got in the car and was driving home, and I had this weird sinking feeling. And I kind of realized, wait a minute, I didn't pay for any of this. Now, I didn't steal it, which would have been good for the family budget. But I didn't do that. But I didn't write a check for it. And actually, I don't even think Best Buy takes checks anymore. And I didn't give them one of my credit cards. And I definitely didn't pay in cash. Well, what I did do is I signed my name on a couple Best Buy papers. And essentially, I opened up a Best Buy credit card. But when I opened up this Best Buy credit card, I had 18 months. That was the deal. 18 months, no interest, no payment for 18 months. That is a long time. Most TVs are like ancient after 12 months. Like, it's a long time to go without having to pay a payment. You can go a long way buying in our cultural context without having much money at all. And some of you parents know this from the inside, where you'll have your 13-year-old daughter or son come home and they'll say to you, Mom, I have to get those new shoes. You say, you don't have to. Mom, I will die if I don't get those new shoes. And you're a little perplexed, because looking into her eyes or his eyes, you think, I know you won't die, but the intensity of their eyes kind of convinces you maybe there's something to this. And you know that there's this hyperbole, that this isn't true, but the intensity, I will die. Do you want me to die? I will die if you don't get me these new jeans or these new shoes. And I think what actually is happening, what we're getting triggered on, is that the young person actually has a point. That they are using these shoes or these pants or whatever the purchase might be to project their very identity of who they are. And it does feel like social suicide to not have those things to project who I am. Now, I'm not saying we should get it for them, but the intensity is fairly legitimate, and we feel caught because of that. And I think what's happened in our cultural context is that we often find parents who will give their kids credit cards with sometimes a $2,000 credit limit on it, and they'll allow them to spend, and they don't really know why they will, but they do. And I think it has something with this kind of sense that they recognize that this has something to do with their identity. And if they can't quickly purchase what they need, then maybe they won't be able to project who they are. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying we all feel kind of pulled into that. It's very interesting that one of the places in our cultural context where we've often started a national debate, but it never goes anywhere, is actually the ease it is to get a credit card for young people. Do you know where the easiest place to get a credit card for young people are? College campuses, that's right. That you could actually, when you go to register for classes for the new semester, you'll go into the quad, and there will be a table for signing up for Biology 101, for the Ultimate Frisbee club team, and a Visa Gold card, all in the same area. And we're actually sending college students out of college with, what, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 of student loan debt, and often $6,000, $7,000, $10,000 of credit card debt. But we never really can have the national debate because I think deep in our back of our consciousness, we kind of feel like, well, when you're a young person, you have to have the available capital to go buy the new phone or buy the new shoes or get the concert tickets because you need to use that to actually project who you are. So this is a big transition, that we actually use what we buy to project who we are instead of maybe what we do in the world. But I think we've seen another transition. And we've seen a transition actually from love as some kind of commitment to intimacy. Now, if you've been around pop culture in the last, 5, 6 years, you know that the vampire is everywhere. You know, like you just turn on a CW show and there's usually a vampire on it. That the vampire is actually everywhere. And that probably the thing that brought the vampire into our cultural reality was, remember the Twilight series? Those books, these were young adult books, particularly written for young women. And it was all about Bella, and she was in a love triangle with Jacob and Edward, which Jacob was a vampire, is that right? And Edward was the other way around? Yeah, so you can always tell the people who are real fans. Yeah, it just outed you as a real fan. Some people are like, no, it was this way. But she was in a love triangle between these folks. And then they made them into movies, from books to movies. And they actually knew when they would make them from books to movies that they would do really well, because particularly they thought young women would go because young women were fans of the books. But to their surprise, not only did young women go and become big-time fans, but actually middle-aged women went and became huge Team Edward, Team Jacob fans, huge fans, and would fight over this. But what's really interesting about this whole Twilight phenomenon, but particularly the vampire phenomenon, is that it plays perfectly within the cadence of intimacy. And what I mean by intimacy. Like when you think about this within a strict plausibility structure, like sociologists will often tell us that people tend to do what they plausibly imagine someone like them would do. Like when you think about this within a strict plausibility structure, honestly, who really wants to marry a vampire? I mean, do you really want to marry a vampire? Do you really want to spend your whole life with a vampire? Do you want to grow old with a vampire? People, they're vampires, they don't grow old. Do you want to have a baby with a vampire? I know Bella in these movies has a baby with a vampire, which makes it so weird. But do you want to have a baby with a vampire, and you're like up late nursing your baby, trying to get it to sleep, and of course your vampire husband's up because he's a vampire. He's not sleeping at night. So you turn to him and say, will you rock our baby to bed so I can get a little sleep? And he takes your baby into his arms and looks at your baby's neck, and his fang comes out. Come on, you don't want to really marry a vampire. You don't want to take a vampire home to meet your grandmother. You don't really want to marry a vampire. But within the cadence of intimacy, these kind of self-gratifying feelings of closeness, that the vampire is sexy. The vampire is alluring because he's dangerous. You know you shouldn't be close to the vampire, but something inside you draws. It's exciting. It's moving. It makes you feel alive. And I think what's happened in our cultural context is we've now said that our identities aren't built on these relationships of commitment over time, but what actually is important are these self-gratifying feelings of closeness. And so we'll have people, even in our churches, say things like, it's not that I don't love him anymore. It's just that there's nothing there. Which means that there's none of this kind of electricity. Or it's not that she's not important to me. She's still important to me. It's just that we became two different people. In other words, how I answer the question, who am I, and how she answers the question, who she is, they're different. And I have to, first of all, obey the question, who am I, over and against this commitment. So there's nothing here. Now, I hate to admit this, but I have watched nearly every episode. I guess this gets to what Hans was saying in the introduction. I've watched nearly every episode of The Real World on MTV. See, yes, thank you for laughing. It's shameful, and you can pray for me. If you haven't watched the show, it's about 7 strangers who are picked to live in a house when things stop getting polite and they start getting real. It's The Real World. Now, that is a hilarious joke if you've ever seen the show before, because that's how the show starts. Anyhow, this is the first ever reality show that's ever been on. It is pathetic, and I watch it, and I think to myself, what am I doing with my life? Why am I doing this? And then I tell people it's all for research. It isn't, but that's what I tell people, and that's what I tell myself so I can sleep at night. But I've watched nearly every episode, and if you've watched it nearly every season, all the same stuff happens over and over again. And one of the major themes that always happens is someone comes on the show and they're in love. And they're thinking about getting married. They're in so much love. But then after about week 2 or 3 of the season, it's a shock to them that the relationship that they were in with a person who's not on the show is about to break up because they're just out partying every night, and they wonder why this relationship might implode. Well, a few seasons back, they were in D.C., and that's exactly what was happening to this young man. He was in love with this woman. The relationship did not look like it was going to hold together, and he spent the long night up talking to one of his roommates. And she was great. I mean, she just listened to him, showed him great empathy, and he just talked. Didn't interrupt him, just listened. After he was done sharing how hard this was, she turned to him and she said, "You know what I think, Trey?" I mean, it was now time for her to give her advice, and she touched his elbow and she said, "You know what I think, Trey? You know what I think, Trey? Trey, I just think if it's hard, it shows you it's not meant to be." Now, if you've been in a relationship for like more than 5 or 10 minutes, you just know it's hard. It's just dang hard. I mean, it's beautiful and wonderful, but all it is hard. It's wonderful, but all it is hard. But that is the kind of world we live in, especially when this kind of self-gratifying intimacy is what drives us. That self-gratifying intimacy is never hard. You'd like not to make out with a person at the office Christmas party, but you end up doing it. That you're drawn to this person. And I think this transition has often happened that we've said what matters is that you have these kind of self-gratifying feelings of closeness. So we've seen this transition from work to consumption, from love as commitment to these kind of self-gratifying feelings of closeness. And just think about how this potentially changes the church. Now, I'm not one that likes to do generational theory. Like, if you were born in this period and like this music, you're like this. If you were born in this time, then that means you're like this. I'm not one that likes that very much. I think societies and cultures are too complicated to assume that just the year you were born determines kind of who you are. But having said that, I think we do have a certain generational issue that we're confronting in the church. And this is the generational issue. I think we have a group of people who came of age really constructing their identity around work and commitment. And see the church as being something that you work at and that you're committed to. And we have another generation of people, which I would include myself in this, who really came of age constructing our identities around consumption and intimacy, and see the church as something that you should kind of consume, and it should kind of be gratifying. When it's not, you should find a different church or a different preacher to go listen to. And we have a potentially big issue in American Christianity confronting us, is that eventually these people who saw the church as something you work at and are committed to, eventually they're not going to be with us. And those of us who constructed our identity around consumption and intimacy are going to inherit a bunch of buildings that we have no will to manage whatsoever. In a little church that my wife's a pastor of, we're a little church. And when it snows on a Saturday night, a magical thing happens. When we go to church on Sunday morning, the steps are shoveled. If the boiler breaks in the basement, a bunch of men and women grab wrenches and tools and go to the basement and fix it. I can tell you right now, and this is a confession, that when it becomes my turn, I'm not doing it. I'm not going to do it. And for some good reason. I would rather be reading my daughter a story at bedtime than at the church shoveling the steps. But we're going to have a big issue to face of what we're going to do when we inherit all these buildings and have no will to manage them whatsoever. And it becomes a big question for us. I mean, people often talk about talking to particular people older in our congregations and saying things like, hey, we could really use some help with a VBS program this year. And someone saying, you know what? I've already done that. I did my work, and now I'm off the hook. So both ask pretty good questions each other. The older generation asks the younger generation, like, really, consumption and intimacy are strong enough to build your identity around? And the younger generation asks a good question of the older generation, which is really you're going to ask people to come into the church out from the world and actually construct an identity around work and commitment that they don't do in their day-to-day lives. And this is a big challenge that we're going to have to face. And when we think about actually having faith out in the world, how do we construct our identities? How do we answer this question, who am I, up against consumption or intimacy, up against the way commitment and love as commitment and vocation is kind of dissipated? Now, a big question for us is like, why the change? Why the change, actually? Well, without this sounding too weirdly sci-fi, I think our experience of time and space has actually changed a great deal. Now, that does seem a little weirdly sci-fi, but a sociologist named Zygmunt Bauman actually says that now, for all of us, the state of our being is one of motion, that we're almost all moving all the time. And most of you have been very polite, and some of you are masters at hiding, checking your phone while you're in it with a group of people. But I am not naive enough to think that some of you haven't been on multiple websites and reading a Twitter feed and looking at Instagram while you've been sitting in this room. Actually, one of the most anxious moments I have as a teacher is when I'm up in front of a group of students, and almost every student I have has their computer screen open, and I'll be in the middle of a great point that I know is changing students' lives. At least in my mind it is. And I'll be at a really important piece of my lecture, and I'll look at a student, and I'll see him out of the corner of my eye, and he'll have his computer screen open, and then he'll have kind of a wry smile on his face. And I think to myself, I don't think I'm saying anything funny. So I immediately check my zipper to make sure that's not down, because that could be a big problem. And then I realized very quickly that he's smiling not because of anything I've said. It's because he's not just in this room. Of course, he is in the room, and he's taking notes, probably with a Word doc or a Google doc open, but he's also probably messaging with someone or reading a blog or doing something else, that he's in the room, but he's also not in the room. And the state of all of our being now is we're always in a constant state of motion. And the great advantage of constructing your identity around consumption and intimacy is that they can happen very quickly. Like I had said earlier, all you have to do is change your consumer